right, everybody. So we have gotten to the battles of the Revolutionary War. So we've talked about a few. We talked about what led up to the Revolutionary War. We talked about Lexington and Concord, the Battle of Bunker Hill, the Declaration of Independence, and the Battle of Trenton, which is the surprise attack that Washington did when he crossed the Delaware. But we're going to keep moving because there's more that happened. The war did not end. It lasted a long time. And so that's why our lesson today is called The Long Road to Victory, because it seemed like there were bits and snippets where the Patriots were winning and their spirits were high, but really, for most of the war, the British were the victors. They were winning more than they were losing, but they just never could quite defeat the Patriots. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the most important battles today, and that's going to lead us up to the end of the Revolutionary War. We're going to talk there, and then next week we'll discuss just a little bit about the effects of the war and what the war means for Americans. But let's just finish up today. Let's go through our agenda. First, we are going to go through, like always, our objectives and our success criteria. We're going to talk about the Battle of Saratoga. We're going to also talk about Valley Forge, a very important part of the Revolutionary War. And then we're going to end We're going to end our lesson today when we talk about the fighting that moved south. Because most of everything that we've talked about so far has happened in the northern colonies in New England, some of the middle colonies with like Philadelphia. Not a lot has happened in the South yet, so we're going to discuss that quite a bit today. So our objective and our success criteria today. First, you should be able to describe some battles of the Revolutionary War. So you should be giving me some details of the Revolution, some of these battles. So the Battle of Saratoga, for example, you should be listening for some important details that makes it important to why we study it. You're going to fill out interactive notebook slides like usual. And this is going to demonstrate your knowledge on some of the battles of the Revolutionary War. It's important for you to know some of these battles because you need to understand how long the Revolutionary War lasted, and it will give you a sense of, I guess, pride to know what these colonists did, how hard they worked, and how long they fought for, what they went through to become separate from Great Britain. And it gives you a lot of respect for these people, and that's why it's important to know some of these battles and what they did. So real quick, what your slides look like today, I'm going to go through those real quick so you know exactly what you're supposed to be doing and what you're listening for. They look very similar. You have done some of these before. And I am going to do a little bit of editing on this, so it will look a little different when you open it up. But first, I want you to talk about the Battle of Saratoga. Tell me where it happened, who was fighting. Don't just write the Continental Army. Tell me who was the leaders. Who were the generals that we're talking about here, okay? What was significant about the outcome? Like, what that means is, why is it important? Why do you think we study it? What do you think the Battle of Saratoga means for the Revolutionary War? Tell me a little bit about what happened, okay? Winter at Valley Forge, I want you to describe some of the conditions. What was it like in the winter at Valley Forge? Tell me a little bit about what it was like. I'm going to edit this just a little bit, so this is going to look just a teeny bit different when you look at it, so I'm going to skip over this. New battlegrounds. There's a few different things that we're going to cover. We are going to talk a lot about conflict in the South, so make sure you're listening very closely and tell me a little bit about what happened in the southern colonies. Why were things changing there? Talk about the conflict in the West. Who was fighting battles there and what was happening in the West? And battles at sea. These are your Navy battles. So please be listening before I talk about a really neat one. I want you to give me some information here. Just tidbits, things that you remember, things that you feel like are important to remember. Then we're going to end your slideshow with the Battle of Yorktown. Preparing for battle, you're going to tell me kind of a little bit about what the Continental Army did to get to Yorktown. Tell me a little bit about what happened in Yorktown, and then the Treaty of Paris. We're not going to talk too much about the Treaty of Paris. I'm going to tell you a little bit. I actually might even edit this. We're going to talk a little bit about the end of the war. Okay? So, back to our slideshow here, so you can describe some battles of the Revolutionary War, and you're going to complete those slides. You are going to have a week to do those. Please turn those into me on Friday. So we're going to start with the Battle of Saratoga. So Great Britain, they had a lot of plans. They had a lot of plans throughout the war. We've talked about several of them. Right now they had been, they were controlling New York City, right? But George Washington had beat the Hessians, or the German soldiers, at the Battle of Trenton in New Jersey. So they didn't want American spirits to stay high for very long. They knew that the more empowered the Patriots were, or the Americans were, the longer this war was going to go on. So they wanted to crush their spirits as easy as they could. And they had pretty high hopes that the Americans were going to give up by the end of the year. And boy, were they wrong. They wanted to control a very important river called the Hudson River. The Hudson River is, it runs through New York City. It's right here, actually. If you look, it's this river right here. They wanted to control this river. This river would help ship supplies to soldiers up in northern New York, and it would connect to some of these other lakes and rivers. If they controlled that, they had a lot of power. They would divide, if they could control that river, one thing that would happen is they would divide the colonies. The colonies were pretty united right now. But if they had control of the Hudson River, they'd be able to divide the colonies, meaning that southern colonies probably wouldn't get much information about what was happening in the northern colonies. Things like the Committee of Correspondence couldn't operate. They were basically going to divide the colonies. It would make it easier for them to defeat. And then there was a British general named Burgoyne. What he did is he marched his army from Canada into New York, because he wanted to beat the Continental Army and gain control of the Hudson River. So he had a big army up in Canada. Remember, they had won that land from France in the French and Canadian War. So they marched their troops down to New York. And what the plan was is there was a British army already in New York City. They had been controlling that. That army was supposed to meet General Burgoyne in northern New York. Okay, in Albany. They were supposed to meet them there. There was another British army that was in the western part of the state that they were also going to be marching and meeting General Burgoyne and the British army from New York City. They were all going to meet. So these three armies were going to meet, and they were going to create this large, like, mega army, and they were going to defeat the Continental Army there, and they were just going to take over the Hudson River, and they would have probably won the war. It was a brilliant plan, and it really most likely would have ended the war with Britain, because they really needed control of that Hudson River. The Continental Army depended on it for a lot of things like communication and supplies. But the thing is, the plan never happened. This was a great plan, but it never happened. General Howe, who was the British general who was in charge of the army in New York City, he was a pretty proud man, and he wanted to meet his other armies up in Albany, New York, but he kind of had the idea that he wanted to defeat Philadelphia first. He thought he could take his army down to Philadelphia, and that he'd have plenty of time to make it back up to northern Albany, He wanted Philadelphia for a couple of reasons. One, it was the largest city in the colonies. At the time, it was extremely important to the colonists because that is where the Continental Congresses were meeting. This is where all of the planning for the war was happening for the Americans. And he thought that if he could take Philadelphia, he would still have time, like I said, to make it to meet the armies, because he assumed it would be a very quick battle. He would win easy because the Continental Army was an untrained army, and he had a large British army that could take control quickly. He was wrong. He never did have time to get up to Albany. He did gain control of Philadelphia. He did win that war, that battle. However, by the time he was done fighting that battle with his army, he didn't have time to make it to Albany, so he didn't even try. So that was one British army that was supposed to meet that never made it. Then this made the northern New York, the armies in northern New York even weaker. But the other British army, the one that was coming from the west, they ran into a little bit of trouble as well. That trouble was the Continental Army. This particular army was being caused the British Army to never even make it to Albany. So there was 2 of the 3 that never even made it, making General Burgoyne even weaker. And he was on his own. And when he got there, General Burgoyne, he was met by a general named General Gates of the Continental Army. It wasn't Washington. He was another very famous leader in the Revolutionary War. And General Gates was who met him. And it wasn't his British armies like he was expecting. Where they met was a place called Saratoga, and it was very close to Albany. In October of 1777, so this is just a little over a year from the Declaration of Independence, the British and Americans fought a battle at Saratoga, and it's just north of Albany. And the Americans won. It was a huge victory. And at the time, 6,000 British soldiers surrendered. This would never have happened if the other 2 British armies had made it. Because of General Howe not thinking that he had plenty of time, that was a big mistake. And then the Continental Army being able to stop the army coming from the west, it was a huge victory. The Battle of Saratoga was a huge victory. It became a turning point in the war for a lot of reasons. First, it was a great victory. The spirits of the Americans were lifted. The Continental Army, the men that were fighting in the Continental Army were even more motivated to stay fighting for their freedoms. The colonists around the colonies heard of this and they would celebrate and they'd get even more excited about fighting against the British. But it also gave America their very first ally in the war. An ally would be a friend, so another country to come and help fight on their side, on our side. And that country was France. So do you remember how the French and British had been fighting for a really long time? And the French actually just lost a war to Great Britain, a war that even these colonists fought against the French in. Well, the French were mad and they wanted revenge. And one way to get this revenge was to help the colonies break away from Great Britain. It made that Great Britain empire just a little bit weaker. And before the Battle of Saratoga, France would send supplies here and there, and they'd send a little money to America to help with the war. But after Saratoga, France believed the Americans could actually win. And so they continued to send their supplies and money, but what they really sent that was very, 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 very helpful was soldiers. So French soldiers came over to help fight, and a naval fleet, which means ships full of cannons to fight on the ocean. And it's really safe to say that if the French had never gotten involved and had become our allies, the American Revolution the Americans may never have even won the war. That takes us to Valley Forge. So that was October of 1777. That's starting the beginning of winter. And we're in New England. And if you remember our lessons early on, New England is a pretty cold area. It's pretty cold. Lots of snow, pretty icy. And it was the winter of 1777 to 1778 was probably the worst time of the entire Revolutionary War. The British had control of Philadelphia, so that was kind of a weak spot. People were upset about that, but then the Continental Army couldn't get into the Philadelphia area. Washington had sent soldiers to battle the British for Philadelphia a couple times, and both times he lost. They were battles that Washington didn't win. Remember, he didn't win every battle. In fact, he probably lost a lot more than he won. And since winter was coming after these losses, he decided that he was going to find a place for his troops to camp for the entire winter. And what they named it was Valley Forge. And this was an open field just about 20 miles northeast of Philadelphia. So it was pretty close to Philadelphia. So you're in your middle Atlantic colonies. It's pretty cold there. It snows quite a bit. And by the time they got to this open field, it had already started to snow. And when they got there, they had to start setting up their tents and their huts wherever they could. And they had to do that on frozen ground. And it was a hard and cold winter. There were nearly 2,000 of these tents and huts they put up. This is kind of what they would have looked like in this picture here. There would have been about 2,000 of these. They were very drafty, they were dirty, they were cold, but at least there was a roof over the soldiers' heads. They did have fireplaces, kind of close, but there were no windows, and so the smoke made men cough so bad, and it created a lot of breathing problems for the men of the Continental Army. And because the winter was so bad, and because the British had control of Philadelphia, supplies didn't arrive, and the winter was truly, truly awful. Many of these men didn't even have blankets, and there was rarely enough food for everybody. So many men were hungry. Some men even wore out their boots and had to wrap their feet in rags to protect them from the snow or ground, which did really very little. I don't know if you've ever walked barefoot on icy snow, not the soft, cushy snow, the icy snow. After a long time, your feet are so cold, it feels like knives when you step down on them. And their feet would get cuts, open sores, and they'd wrap them in these cloths. And there's a quote I'm going to show you here. George Washington said that you might have been able to track the army to Valley Forge by the blood of their feet. And what he's saying is there were so few people that had actual shoes and their feet were bleeding because they were so, and it was just a terrible time that when they'd walk, they'd leave bloody footprints in the snow. And that's a true thing. It was a very, very awful time of the winter. And because of the cold and because of the conditions, meaning what they lived in, they didn't have, they didn't have blankets, many of them. They had, their feet would get infected, but then also lots of disease would go through this camp. And at least 2,500 soldiers died that winter. And that means every single day, soldiers would have to bury 25 to 30 of their friends every single day. That time was so hard that even some soldiers decided to desert the army. They didn't think they could make it. Desert means they'd run away. They gave up their station as a soldier, and it is actually a very terrible thing to do, and you can be punished for it, actually. At the beginning of the war, or of the winter, Washington went from about 7,000 men to only 4,000 by the end of the winter, just because of the conditions here at Valley Forge. It was a terrible, terrible time. But there was one good thing that came from that winter. And that was that Washington befriended a man from Europe named von Steuben. Von Steuben. He was a European general that befriended Washington, and Washington recognized that this man knew a whole lot about training soldiers how to fight. He was a gift. He was very smart. He had a great way he's kind of like a really good coach. He knew how to teach men, ordinary farmers, to be great soldiers. And so Washington that winter hired von Steuben to train his Continental Army. And here's kind of a picture of what that would sort of look like. He started training them. All winter long, von Steuben trained these men every day, every single day, from sunup to sundown. And by the spring, those 4,000 men that Washington had was a well-trained army for the very first time. He had men that knew how to fight a war, not just fire a gun, actually knew how to fight in a war. And von Steuben wasn't the only European that would come and help the Americans train for war. There was another man. He was a 19-year-old Frenchman named Marquis de Lafayette. He actually became one of Washington's most trusted aides, and he helped train the Continental Army as well. That leads us to the fighting, leads us to the battles in the South. So the British had another plan. The plan wasn't working so great for them up in the north, so they decided they needed to come up with something different. For 3 years, the British had been fighting the Continental Army in the north. They weren't getting very far. They had won nearly all the battles, but they still just were not able to completely defeat the Americans. They needed to really defeat them to win. In a big battle, they needed to have a huge battle and win. But every time they got close, George Washington and his army would slip away. They would just disappear and hide. It was a great tactic on George Washington's side. George Washington was brilliant that way. They changed their tactics. The British did. They decided they wanted to beat the Americans in the South. They wanted to move their fighting to the South, and not much had happened in the South at this point. There's a couple reasons for this. There were a lot of loyalists in the South, and so they knew that the loyalists would join the British Army and help fight against the colonists, which is a sad truth. That is truly what they did. And if they took the South, the Continental Army would have less places to hide, since there were British controlling the North and now the South. It would completely, these southern colonies were kind of not having, there were no fighting. There wasn't really a lot of fighting happening here. And so that was a great place to kind of hide. And same thing with the mid-Atlantic colonies. Not a lot of fighting had been happening there at that point. But if the British held control of the southern colonies and New England, then the Continental Army didn't have as many places to slip away, and George Washington and his Continental Army would be easier to find and to defeat. It was pretty successful for quite a while. This lasted for a long time. The British took control of Savannah, Georgia, actually quite quickly. They did this with their navy because Savannah is right on the ocean. Right after they took control of Savannah, they eventually just kind of gained all control of Georgia, that's most southern state, which was it was a pretty big victory for the British and pretty awful for the Continental Army. They then took control over a town called Charleston, South Carolina, and this was one of the biggest losses for the Americans throughout the whole war. That was a huge. Once they gained that, the British gained that, it was looking like they were going to be able to gain control of all of the South. From there, the British continued to control a large portion of the South. So you've got South Carolina and Georgia, but they had ties to North Carolina and all of those other southern colonies as well. So it was pretty hard for the Continental Army to get any kind of victory. But they still could not crush their enemy, no matter how hard they tried. Part of this was because the military leaders for America were starting to follow Washington's lead. They heard how Washington was winning his battles up in the north, so they kept doing the same thing. They would fight small battles. They would never risk their soldiers in a large battle that they couldn't win against the British. So they would fight these small battles and they'd slip away so they wouldn't lose large amounts of their soldiers. The other thing is Southerners knew their land really well. The land in the South is completely different than England. So British soldiers were not familiar with swamps and humidity and really the climate and the terrain of the South. And so this was a huge advantage for the Southern soldiers. They had secret bases in the swamps of South Carolina, and they would sneak up on the British soldiers and then disappear. This is called guerrilla warfare, and it's a tactic that's still used today. They would hide and then sneak up on them, fight, and then slip away again. And this is kind of a picture of what that would look like. Though they never officially lost, and the battles were small, there were still a lot of deaths and injuries through all of this fighting. And there was nothing. The Continental Army wasn't winning, but neither was the British Army. It just continued this vicious cycle of small battles, and people were tiring of it. But it wasn't just the southern parts of the colonies that were fighting was happening, or in New England either. There was some wars or some battles in the West. And the British were taking control of the West until a young Virginian named George Rogers Clark and his army began attacking British forts along the Ohio River. Remember, that was a very important river valley that during the French and Indian War, and the British had control of all of these forts. Forts would have tons of supplies and tons of just really anything you needed for a war. And so George Rogers Clark decided he was going to take his armies and start taking over these forts. On July 4th, 1778, Clark and his small army actually captured the very first of the British forts without even firing a single shot. They surrounded the fort and just basically put a siege on the British soldiers until they surrendered. And he went on to capture 2 more forts, and these were impressive and super important wins for the Americans. They needed the supplies and they needed the motivation and the morale that taking over these British forts gave them. These victories, because the British had no control over the forts anymore, drove the British out of the land that was between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. So that land now belonged to the Americans. The Continental Army had control of all of that. That was a huge, huge, big deal for the Revolutionary War. And there was also some fighting on the sea, on the ocean. Remember that England is an island, so it stands to reason that they would have had the most powerful, or one of the most powerful navies in the world. They were the largest empire at the time. And I mentioned a while back that America really could not even compare to their naval fleet. We had like 1 ship to every 500 that they had, or something like that. So it was pretty hard to win a war at sea with the British. So the American Navy really was no match for the British Navy. But they were still really able to put up a good fight when one ship met another ship at a time. So instead of many ships meeting at a time, if there was 1 to 1, the Americans had a pretty good chance. And there's a really, really famous one that I'm going to talk to you about right now. And it was between an American ship commander named John Paul Jones. He came upon in his ship a British ship. The 2 ships commenced firing at each other with cannons, a lot like what you would see in a pirate movie. And they kept shooting at each other for a long time, and eventually the American ship that was ran by John Paul Jones went up in flames, which pretty much meant that it was going to sink. And the British believed they won. The British commander actually even demanded that Jones surrender, and Jones replied to him, "I have not yet begun to fight." And his ship did sink. Jones's ship did sink, but not until after Jones and his men climbed aboard the British ship and took it over, winning that small little Navy battle. And this is one of the most famous naval battles in U.S. history, actually. So we're going to keep talking about some battles in the South. Those were a couple important things to remember: the battles in the West, or conflicts in the West, and then conflict at sea. We talked about how Britain had kind of gained control of most of the South at this point. They had control of South Carolina and Georgia, and really with South Carolina, they had a pretty good chance of taking control of North Carolina as well. But the British made a fatal, fatal mistake. So even though things were going really well, they were in Great Britain's favor, they were pretty much winning at this point, the British made one big mistake that actually ended up costing them the entire war. There was a British general in charge of the armies in the South, and his name was Lord Charles Cornwallis. And he spent a whole year chasing the Continental Army in the South. He just never could catch up with them. There was a battle of Kings Mountain that happened on the North and South Carolina borders, and the Americans actually won this small battle. And seeing that the plan that they had set up originally was still not working, because they still just could not control the Continental Army, they just kept losing. They would fight these little small battles, and they just couldn't get a big battle to play out so that the British could win. Seeing this, Cornwallis decided that he wanted to march his whole army up to Virginia. So this is Kings Mountain. He marched his whole army all the way up here to Virginia. He thought that if he could take Virginia, that would defeat the Continental Army in Virginia, and they would finally win the war. There was a lot of Continental soldiers in Virginia. There was a lot of very important leaders in Virginia. So that was a pretty important colony. So they thought if they could take control of that, it would not be long before the Americans surrendered. So in the summer of 1781, so you guys remember the Declaration of Independence happened at 1776. The Proclamation of 1763, like that's how many years we've covered, okay? But the actual fighting had been going on for almost 5 years now. So in the summer of 1781, Cornwallis chose a small Virginia town called Yorktown for his base. And it was here he thought that the British Navy would be able to bring troops and supplies to help the British Army. If he could get more troops and supplies, then he was even stronger. But usually, so this was kind of a very unusual thing for a general to do, because where he set up base was where there was a river behind them. And usually an army would not set up a base that close to having water on both sides of them. So you had an ocean on one side and then you had a river on the other. Because there was nowhere to retreat or to run away if they got surrounded. But Cornwallis felt pretty safe because he had at that time 1/3 of the British soldiers in America with him. So even though there was still a lot of soldiers up in the New England colonies and quite a few in the very southern Georgia area, he had a lot of soldiers and he had access to his navy. So he felt pretty safe there at Yorktown. So while Cornwallis was settling in Yorktown, Washington, up in New England, was meeting with a French general named Rochambeau. Rochambeau brought a big army to help the Americans, and a larger French fleet was on its way. So this French army came over, and there were more French soldiers coming over in ships, and there was a French navy that was on its way to help the Americans win the war. And originally the plan was to attack the British in New York because they had control over New York at the time. And they thought if they could gain New York back, they would win. However, news traveled that Cornwallis was in Yorktown, surrounded by water. He had the ocean, and then he also had the river behind him. It was a huge mistake, and they heard about it. They found out, and they wanted to take advantage of his mistake, of Cornwallis's mistake. And they knew that with the French army there were enough men to trap Cornwallis and the British army. And if the French fleet, the navy, got there in time, they'd be able to stop the British navy from helping the British army. And so it took about a month to march to Yorktown from New England. They marched down on foot, and then they took a few more days and they dug a ring of trenches around Yorktown. So trenches are like kind of tunnels in the ground, except for they're open to kind of protect you from fire. They dug a ring, like a half ring, around the whole city of Yorktown. And they did this for a few days. And by then, they had the whole city of Yorktown, or the little town of Yorktown, and the British Army completely surrounded. And on October 9th, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the very first cannon was fired and the Battle of Yorktown had begun. So here's our very first big battle, and it would be the last, of the Revolutionary War. For the first time in the war, Washington had the most guns and cannons, and for the very first time, the most men on his side. And Cornwallis had looked to the sea and the Navy for help, but no one came. There was no British Navy to help Cornwallis because the French fleet had gotten there. They drove off the British fleet. Again, so that's why I said at the beginning, it's very likely that without the French as our allies at the time, we would never have won this war. Cornwallis and his army was on his own. And each day, the fighting would happen, Washington moved his army just a little bit closer. He would inch just a little bit closer every single day. And during this battle, Washington was so sure that they had the upper hand that he even rode along with his men fighting, even though it was in a tremendous risk to put your leader in danger like that. Usually generals stood in the back and kind of watched the fighting happen. This time he actually got in the middle of it and fought too. And his soldiers would see him and they would cheer and they would continue to fight. They knew it was, if Washington was fighting, then they could fight too. And Cornwallis was officially trapped, and on October 17th, so that's 8 days after the first cannon went off, Cornwallis officially surrendered. So that is the Battle of Yorktown. This was the last big battle of the Revolutionary War. There were several small battles that happened shortly after, but really this ended the war. This was the end of the American Revolutionary War. We are going to talk about the kind of the effect of the American Revolutionary War, the importance of it next week. But we talked about why the colonists wanted to separate from England, what they did to try to get England to work with them, and eventually we talked about the Declaration of Independence when we finally declared that we were going to be independent from England. And now we've talked about some of the major battles. These were not the only battles, but these were some major battles of the American Revolution. You'll learn more about them in the next few years when you get into middle school, but these were just some of the most important ones. So just listening to kind of some of the things that they went through, I think you can have a lot of respect for the colonists at the time because they went up against the largest military in the world, the biggest empire in the world, and it was just farmers and some wealthy businessmen that ended up winning this war. It was tremendous. I want you guys now to go start working on your slides and have those turned in to me by Friday.